Hi everybody, thanks for joining me once again as I continue to review Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ, a chapter at a time from an atheist perspective. I'm about to start reviewing Chapter 11, The Medical Evidence. Was Jesus' death a sham and his resurrection a hoax? By the way, if you can hear that noise in the background and the occasional pounding sound, the house across the street is having a new roof put on it or something, and they're running a generator. I know I can hear it. I suspect you can hear it too, although hopefully to a lesser degree. So I apologize for the background noise. So let's get started with Chapter 11. The opening section, the anecdote that opens the chapter, is about Dr. Robert J. Stein this time. Stein was the medical examiner for Cook County, Illinois, and he was one of the world's leading forensic pathologists. He performed over 20,000 autopsies, and evidence that he found and presented led to the conviction of many people of crimes, including murder, most famously perhaps John Wayne Gacy, who was convicted of 33 counts of murder as a result, in part, of evidence provided by Dr. Robert J. Stein. And Strobel uses the example of Dr. Stein to emphasize for us the importance of medical evidence in determining what actually happened to cause the death of a given person, whether it was accidental or the result of a deliberate action, determining the time of death, all sorts of interesting and relevant, important information when you're trying to figure out what happened. And Strobel says that medical evidence can be used to determine whether or not the resurrection of Jesus actually happened or was a hoax. And there are two things that jump out at me right away before we even get to the interview for this chapter. And those two things are, number one, most obviously, there is no medical evidence related to the crucifixion. None. And second, the actually happened or hoax dilemma is another false dichotomy. It's possible and very likely that the resurrection of Jesus was neither an actual event or a hoax. It's possible that it never happened or appeared to happen at all. Now, the next section is resurrection or resuscitation. Strobel sets up his primary target for this chapter, and that is the swoon theory. The swoon theory claims that Jesus did not actually die on the cross. He only appeared to die. And then when he was seen post-crucifixion, and the appearances that are claimed to be the evidence of his resurrection, it was actually just Jesus coming to after he had swooned. Strobel says, quote, "Like an urban myth, the swoon theory continues to flourish. I hear it all the time in discussing the resurrection with spiritual seekers. But what does the evidence really establish? What actually happened at the crucifixion? What was Jesus' cause of death? Is there any possible way he could have survived this ordeal? Those are the kinds of questions I hoped medical evidence could help resolve." I bet it would be nice for Lee if those questions could be settled by the medical evidence. Too bad there isn't any. So now we come to the 10th interview, and it's Dr. Alexander Metherell, MD, PhD. He's two kinds of doctor. And he has a medical degree from the University of Miami. He has a doctorate in engineering from the University of Bristol. He's board certified in diagnosis by the American Board of Radiology. He's a consultant to the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute of the National Institutes of Health. He's a former research scientist. He taught at the University of California. He's been the editor of 5 scientific books written for journals like American Medicine, Scientific American, The Physiologist, Biophysics Journal, and other publications. And he was chosen for this book by Lee Strobel, not just for his medical credentials, but also, as Strobel says, for his ability to discuss the crucifixion dispassionately. And that ability to discuss the crucifixion dispassionately is very important to Strobel, because Strobel, like many Christians, finds the crucifixion very, very upsetting, which is why Christians love to hear it discussed in gruesome, gory detail, and also to see it reenacted in similar fashion. And for a witness to that, look no further than The Passion of the Christ, which would demonstrate this point very vividly a few years after The Case for Christ was first published. Christians, they hate the crucifixion. It's very upsetting to them. It just breaks their heart, and yet they love to just wallow in the guts of Jesus. It's kind of twisted. So next section, the torture before the cross. Speaking of the passion of the Christ, Metherell describes the scourging of Christ in detail, and I'll go ahead and say loving detail, starting with the night before the crucifixion in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus is so distressed over his imminent execution that he sweats blood. And Metherell attributes the blood sweating to hematidrosis, which is a very rare but nonetheless a very real medical condition where people undergoing extreme stress will have the capillaries around their sweat glands will actually burst, and some blood will mix with their sweat and tinge it red, and they'll actually look like they're sweating blood, even though they're actually still sweating sweat. It's just been colored by a relatively small amount of blood, but it gives the appearance of a person sweating blood. Hematidrosis also makes the victim's skin very sensitive, which would have made the scourging even more painful for Jesus. And to me, this is all very interesting. I admit, I've said in previous videos, I'm a fan of textual analysis, and that's what I consider this. I don't find it persuasive at all in terms of accepting Christianity or persuading me that the Gospels are historically valid, but in sifting through the details, trying to find out what actually happened, applying science or medical theories to things like the sweating blood during the agony in the garden, I find that really interesting. But it's also completely irrelevant, in this case, to determining what happened to Jesus, since, as we discussed in a previous video, the reference in the Gospel of Luke to Jesus sweating blood during the agony in the garden was added by early Christians who wanted to discourage the doctrine of docetism, or the belief that Jesus was only human in appearance, and he didn't actually suffer from the scourging and the crucifixion. Metherell describes the actual scourging of Christ, careful not to miss a single precious bloody detail. The leather whip with the bits of metal and bone braided into it, the shredding of the flesh and muscle, the exposing of the bone, the fantastic amount of blood that was lost. Basically, if you've seen The Passion of the Christ, this will read like a page from the script. And due to the extreme blood loss, Metherell diagnoses Jesus as being in hypovolemic shock following the scourging. And as evidence for this, he points out that Jesus is unable to carry the patibulum, which is the crossbeam of the cross, the horizontal portion that he was actually nailed to. And also that Jesus said, "I thirst," at one point, and thirst is a symptom of hypovolemic shock, what with your body needing fluids to replace all that blood that fell out of you. Next section, the agony of the cross. Strobel says, quote, "As distasteful as the description of the flogging was, I knew that even more repugnant testimony was yet to come. That's because historians are unanimous that Jesus survived the beating that day and went on to the cross." Now actually, historians are not even unanimous that Jesus existed, let alone was scourged and crucified, but we're pretending that arguments that question the existence of Jesus or the historical reliability of the Gospels don't exist, so I'll just play along with Lee and say, sure, Lee, why not? Historians are unanimous, Jesus survived the scourging and went on to the cross. Okay, let's move on. Metherell gets into all the really juicy particulars of the crucifixion that Christians love to feel good about, feeling guilty about. The 5 to 7 inch nails driven in through the wrists, not the palms, as Metherell points out, because the palms wouldn't have been able to hold the weight. The nails would have ripped right through. The crushing of the nerves of the wrists and the ankles as the nails were driven through, causing pain that was so indescribably intense that the word excruciating had to be invented. The word excruciating is derived from crucifixion, pain from out of crucifixion, excruciating. And by the way, don't Christians... I've never heard an atheist or a non-Christian point out to me the etymology of the word excruciating. It's always a Christian that tells me, oh, you know, excruciating comes from the crucifixion because that's just how much Jesus suffered. There's a really, really kind of twisted, perverse undercurrent of sadism to Christianity that most Christians aren't even conscious of, to be fair. But it's definitely there. The preoccupation with blood and pain and suffering is something that most Christians don't realize, but many non-Christians, myself included, find that just blatantly obvious and a little creepy. Next section, the cause of death. Breathing when you're nailed to a cross is incredibly difficult, and it leads inevitably to exhaustion, and that's ultimately what kills you. You have trouble breathing, carbon dioxide builds up in your blood, and it dissolves in your blood into carbonic acid, and this gives you an irregular heartbeat, and eventually you suffer from cardiac arrest and you die. And this, according to Metherell, was the cause of death of Jesus on the cross. And presumably everybody else who was ever crucified. I mean, it's not just Jesus who suffered these things. The Romans crucified other people who are not important. The shock, the hypovolemic shock, and the irregular heartbeat would also have resulted in pericardial and pleural effusions, fluid building up around the heart and the lungs, which would explain why when Jesus was stabbed in the side by the Roman soldier, the wound gushed blood and also a clear fluid that would have been the fluid from the pleural effusion and the pericardial effusion, which John in his gospel mistakes for water. And at this point, Metherell says, quote, "There was absolutely no doubt that Jesus was dead." Next section, answering the skeptics, Strobel begins by saying, quote, "Dr. Metherell's assertion seemed well supported by the evidence." What evidence? Here, I'll show you the evidence. You want to see the evidence? Right here. This is the evidence he's talking about. Right here. The Bible. This is what supports Dr. Metherell's assertions. Metherell cites a single archaeological find. There may have been more, but he only cites one. The remains of a Jew named Johanan, who had been crucified around the year 70, whose foot was found pierced by a 7-inch nail that still had bits of wood clinging to it. And he cites this as evidence that people were crucified in a manner similar to that described in the Jesus narrative. And again, he brings this up and he cites this as evidence for the crucifixion and for his case, and Strobel cites it as evidence for the case for Christ. And it's another incident of the hasty conclusion fallacy that we've seen in chapters in this book previously. The chapters about the corroborating evidence, the scientific evidence, the archaeological evidence, where a confirmation of relatively mundane incidental details is taken as confirmation of the story as a whole, including all of the fantastic claims of miracles and angels and resurrections and everything. They say, oh, that all must be true because, see, there was such a place as Nazareth. The two things have nothing to do with each other. Evidence that crucifixions like the one described in the Jesus narrative actually took place is cited as evidence for the truth of the overall narrative itself. But there's a difference between not contradicting and confirming. And there's also a difference between confirming that a man was executed by a particular method and confirming that that same man returned from his death. By showing me the remains of another person who was crucified in a manner similar to Jesus, you are not confirming that Jesus not only was crucified himself, but rose from the dead. It is not the kind of evidence that Metherell and Strobel are trying to claim that it is. So, prompted by Lee Strobel, Dr. Metherell asserts confidently that the Roman soldiers on hand would have been able to positively determine that Jesus was dead when he was taken down from the cross. Remember, the skeptics they are addressing here are those who favor the swoon theory, not those who favor the most of this shit is just made up theory, which would be me. The final argument is the next section, although strangely not the final section in this chapter. Anyway, Strobel says, quote, "Appealing to history and medicine, to archaeology, and even Roman military rules, Metherell had closed every loophole. Jesus could not have come down from the cross alive." Well, yeah, that settles it, I guess. The Christian doctor has reached these conclusions based on an analysis of a 2,000-year-old text whose historical reliability is highly suspect at best, but which he believes to be the infallible, inerrant word of God. So yeah, there's no holes in that argument at all. None. Case closed. Prompted again by Strobel, Metherell emphasizes the horrible state that Jesus would have been in following the crucifixion, even if, by some incredible chance, some miracle if you will, he had survived the crucifixion, as the swoon theory contends, and escaped his tomb, giving the appearance of a resurrection, he would have been in incredible pain with crushed nerves in his hands and feet, covered in blood, flesh shredded, his wrists and his feet just badly injured, virtually destroyed, difficult if not impossible for him to walk, shoulders dislocated from hanging on the cross. In other words, not the Jesus who reportedly appeared to his followers following the resurrection. A Jesus that pathetic, Metcalfe contends, would never have inspired a religious movement built around his triumph over death. And again, Strobel ignores the fact that the Gospels, even by the testimony of some of his own hand-picked experts, contains material that was added to the original texts long after they were first written down for sometimes explicitly political purposes, to strengthen or to weaken a particular doctrine or a particular view of Christ. Why? Knowing that that admission is in this book even, let alone widely accepted by those who would disagree with most of the premises of this book, why is it so unthinkable that a pitiful injured Jesus, or more likely a stone fucking dead Jesus, would be replaced in the story that we find in the Gospels by the immortal, eternal, victorious, resurrected Jesus? I continually am baffled by the refusal of Christians to even accept that as a plausible possibility. They'll believe that Jesus came back from the dead, but if you suggest that maybe people made up the fact that he came back from the dead, oh, that's preposterous. And finally, now this is the last section of the chapter, it's called A Question for the Heart. Strobel begins the section by saying, quote, "Convincingly, masterfully, Metcalfe had established his case beyond a reasonable doubt." Now, we've seen sentences like this from Strobel before. It's one of his manipulation techniques to tell you how convincing and masterful the case is. And I've talked about it in those terms previously, but I want to talk about it now as a writer. Writers and aspiring writers, take note, because this sentence that I just quoted is the kind of sentence you should never, ever allow to remain in your work. Nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes. You will probably, if you're a writer, write a sentence like this at some point in your work. But the bigger mistake than writing the sentence is not getting rid of it as soon as you realize that it's there. It's a horrible sentence, and there are two things wrong with it. First, it's telling rather than showing. Good writing shows, so that it's not necessary to tell in order to get your point across. If Metcalfe's arguments were really so masterful, let them speak for themselves. Secondly, assuming the arguments were that convincing, the sentence is a double beat. It's telling us something that we already know, and that's the best case scenario. The best thing that could be said about this sentence is that it's redundant, it's unnecessary. So even if Metcalfe's arguments were convincing and masterful, you still need to get this sentence the fuck out of your work, because it has no purpose. It's a bad, bad sentence, and Strobel is a really, 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 really bad writer. For all of Strobel's other sins, his dishonesty, his bias, and his denial of that bias, his claims to objectivity that obviously does not exist, he's just a terrible, terrible, terrible writer. And to me, that might be the most offensive thing about him, is that he's just, when it comes right down to it, all the other things you can say about Lee Strobel, he's just a shit writer. And now Strobel and Metcalfe get all mushy when they start discussing why Jesus would willingly experience such an agonizing execution. And this is the other thing I've noticed that Christians just love to fap to. It's the only thing that turns them on even more than dwelling on the suffering of Christ. And that's getting all teary-eyed about the love of Christ for us, that he would do all of that and suffer all that torment for our sake, even though we didn't deserve it because we're all pieces of shit. Quote, "So when you ask what motivated him," Metcalfe concluded, "well, I suppose the answer can be summed up in one word, and that word would be love." You see that? Strobel presumably cleans himself up after that point, knowing what the subject of their discussion would be. I imagine Metcalfe had moist towels already handy for them to use. And then he drives on to his next destination, like some sort of Christian apologetic Incredible Hulk. And he says, quote, "Those who seek to explain away the resurrection of Jesus by claiming that he somehow escaped the clutches of death at Golgotha need to offer a more plausible theory that fits the facts. And honestly, in this case, Lee, you and I agree. I agree 100%. We do need a more plausible theory. And I have a more plausible theory, as it happens. Jesus didn't escape his death on the cross. Jesus is dead. That's it for this chapter. Next, we'll do chapter 12, and I'm really, really looking forward to this one. And you will too, once I tell you why. It is the evidence of the missing body. Was Jesus' body really absent from his tomb? And the expert interviewed by Lee Strobel in chapter 12 is none other than William Lane Craig. That one's going to feel good. So, thank you all for watching once again. I apologize about the noise outside. I think they are actually crucifying Jesus over there. I've heard them hammering nails. Thank you all so much for paying attention to this, for being interested in this. I appreciate all the feedback. I appreciate the comments and the questions and whatever. It's great. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time for William Lane Craig and Chapter 12. Look at this kitty. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Run away.